Welcome to the Indian Sun. I'm Indira Laisram. The alarming surge in coronavirus cases in India has prompted the Australian government to invoke the Biosecurity Act to penalise Australian citizens who want to come home till the travel ban is off. Australia's Biosecurity Act is now making headlines around the world. To talk about this and more, I have with me Dr. Luke Beck. Dr. Luke Beck is an associate professor of constitutional law and associate dean at Monash University's Faculty of Law. He regularly provides advice to parliamentary committee and law reform processes. He's the author of a number of books and many scholarly articles on constitutional law. Welcome, Dr. Luke. My first question to you is, tell us what the Biosecurity Act is, why is it controversial, and what are its implications?
So Australia has a piece of legislation called the Biosecurity Act that was passed in 2015. And it's quite a lengthy and complex piece of legislation, but it includes provisions that give the Federal Health Minister what the legislation calls special powers, which are very, very broad, to impose any requirements or rules that he thinks are necessary to protect public health in Australia from human health risks like the coronavirus pandemic. And in exercising that power recently, the minister imposed a ban on anybody flying from India into Australia for a period of 14 days that expires on the 15th of May. And that has caused quite enormous controversy for a couple of reasons. Firstly, of course, because there are a lot of Indian Australians, there are a lot of Australians who are dual citizens with India, and there are a lot of other Australians who have family and other connections in India. And obviously, of course, a sizable number of Australians in India, about 9,000 people in India at the moment are Australian citizens, according to media reports. And some of them want to come home and can't. So that's caused problems. The second aspect of the controversy is that when the minister announced this 2-week ban on flights from India, he emphasized the press release highlighted what the maximum penalty is for breaching this rule. And the maximum penalty is 5 years imprisonment or a fine of $66,000 or both. Now, obviously, that's quite harsh. That's extraordinarily harsh. And so there's been a bit of public confusion and media confusion about that. Some media reports were suggesting that this is a 5-year prison sentence just for Indians, that it's a 5-year prison sentence just for this rule. And that's not quite right. The 5-year maximum prison sentence is the penalty for breaching any ministerial orders under the Biosecurity Act. That was the maximum penalty set in 2015 when the legislation was passed. So it had nothing to do specifically with coronavirus or specifically with the Indian flights ban, but you can understand the controversy around that by highlighting that. Now, that highlighting it has caused unnecessary controversy and angst amongst people in India and amongst Indian Australians, because a lot of them, because of the way this was presented by the government and the media, thought that they were being targeted by some really harsh penalties, as well as a really tough flights ban rule. Now, of course, people are not going to go to prison. Maximum penalties are very rarely imposed. And in this case, of course, it's probably impossible to actually break this law and commit the crime, because at the moment, during the pause, airlines are not flying from India to Australia. You can't actually, at the moment, you can't fly here from India, which means you can't break the law, which means you won't be punished. And if somebody managed to actually get from India via another country to Australia within the 2-week period, there is absolutely zero chance they will go to jail. Worst case scenario, they'd get a relatively modest fine. But you can understand the controversy around that. Now, was that a mistake on the part of the government, perhaps to highlight something that wasn't real? Or was this a deliberate attempt to distract public attention from other issues in Australia? There are criticisms of Australia's quarantine system. There have been leaks of virus out of the quarantine system, and Australia's vaccine rollout has been quite slow. So it's actually a really interesting issue.
So in that sense, when we say that a law on quarantine legitimately limits the rights of Australian citizen, I mean, how can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, so the Biosecurity Act is very complicated, and Australia's constitutional framework is very complicated. So our constitution gives the federal parliament power to pass laws about various subject matters. One of those subject matters is external affairs, and we call that the external affairs power. And the external affairs power, among other things, lets the federal parliament pass laws about people, places, and events outside of Australia. So a law that regulates or bans travel from a particular country into Australia, that looks like a law about external affairs. So there's probably what we call a head of power to support this law. But there are some other arguments about whether this flights ban is unlawful. And there is a challenge currently in the Australian courts to the validity of this flights ban. And there's two key arguments that the challenger is making. The first argument is a constitutional argument. The challenger wants to say that this flights ban violates an implied constitutional right that Australian citizens have to enter Australia. That's a very difficult argument to win. The chief reason it's a difficult argument to win is because the High Court of Australia has never before recognised that any such right exists. And then even if he overcame that enormous hurdle and convinced the court that there was such a right, he would then have to convince the court that that right is absolute and can never be limited, or he would have to convince the court that it can be limited, but that in this particular case, the flights ban is a disproportionate limitation and therefore violates the constitutional right. And I think that's a very difficult argument to win. I would not be holding my breath on that. And if he pursued that argument, I think he would lose. Now he's making another argument as well. The Biosecurity Act, under which gives the Federal Health Minister power to impose these kinds of rules. It's very broad power the minister has, but it is subject to limitations set out in the Act. And the key limitation is that whatever the minister does must be proportionate in all of the circumstances. And if he can provide expert evidence to prove that this is disproportionate, that something less would have been sufficient to protect Australian public health, then the minister will have exceeded his power and the rule will be invalid. And then, even more complicated, he has a third argument. He wants to say, well, regardless of the proportionality, Australians have a common law right, as opposed to a constitutional right, a common law right to enter Australia. And yes, Parliament can override common law rights if they see fit, but Parliament can only override common law rights if they use very clear and express language. And he's saying that there's nothing in the Biosecurity Act that is express and very clear about overriding this common law right. And if he's right about that, well, then the Biosecurity Act on that legal interpretation does not give the minister power to impose a ban like this. And therefore the minister has done something he doesn't have power to do. And therefore that would be invalid. That's a plausible argument, but it's a very difficult argument to win. And recent history in Australia shows that courts tend to lean towards ideas of community protection, particularly in coronavirus type cases. So it'll be very interesting to see how that goes. And of course, the ban on Indian flights expires on the 15th of May. So that's only a few days away. So this may be over before we get a judgment, a final decision out of the courts.
Okay. I know the ban is on till the 15th of May, but then as you said earlier, that India's cases is not going to die down that soon. So do you think there would be a chance of the ban being extended, or will the government wrap it up, just to save face?
I think there's a very good chance the government will wrap it up to save face. This has provoked quite a lot of controversy and outrage and backlash in Australia. This has not been good for the government. So whilst they may, say the chief medical officer recommended we do this and that this was necessary to protect public health, I think they will let it lapse. And in fact, the government has suggested they might even revoke it a day or two early. So I think the odds of it being extended are very low. I think this will be over by the 15th, and then we'll be able to have some flights coming into Australia from India. And the government has also suggested that they will be organising their own special charter flights to bring Australian citizens home from India, if that's what they want to do, and put them into the quarantine system before they can, go home back to their families and communities here.
Also, given that this act was invoked more out of a fear factor, do you think the allegations of racism hold some merit?
Well, so there have been allegations that this is a racist ban because people are saying that it's harsher than flight bans that have been imposed in other countries like the United States and the United Kingdom when they had past outbreaks. The government says that's not true. The government says that there's something really different going on here with the current Indian outbreak. It's such a wide and horrifying outbreak in India at the moment there are multiple variants at play. And the chief medical officer, in his advice to the health minister, said that since March this year, more than half of all overseas acquired cases found in Australia have come from India. So the government says at the moment, there is a special and different and significant risk with respect to the virus coming out of India. And so they need time, they need a pause to ramp up Australia's quarantine system to be able to deal with this influx of very high risk returned travellers.
Also,
but
when we talk,
that doesn't take away the fact that it's hugely controversial and has upset the Indian community in Australia, particularly because they think they are being targeted by very harsh penalties.
And also, when we talked about the challenges and the constitutional rights earlier, I forgot to ask you, isn't this a violation of international human rights?
Well, so there are some people who say that this is a violation of international human rights law, that international human rights law gives every person the right to enter their own country as part and parcel of being a citizen. And there has been a complaint lodged about that through the UN Human Rights Committee system. That's an interesting issue, but in terms of legal validity, that has no impact whatsoever. So the UN Human Rights Committee is not a court, it's just a committee, and it only has power to make recommendations. So even if this is a breach of international law, as a matter of Australian law, it kind of doesn't matter legally. Now, obviously that matters in a moral and ethical sense. Just because you have power under Australian law to do something doesn't mean you should do it. You know, when the government chose to exercise this power in this particular way, even if that is legally valid, that doesn't mean it's the right or ethical thing to do. You can still say this is a valid law, but a bad law. And I think that's probably where the legal challenges will end up. This is a valid law, but there are lots of legitimate arguments to say that it's a bad law.
Anything else that you wanted to add to just assuage the fears of the many Indian community people over here?
Yeah, so this ban is going to lift on the 15th, almost certainly, possibly even sooner. The government is promising to send charter flights over to India to bring Australian citizens back. There is absolutely zero chance of anybody going to prison, but that doesn't take away the fact that for this 2-week period, there are a bunch of people in India who want to come to Australia and can't. You know, and there will be situations where there are weddings and funerals. There are people who's, you know, because of the seriousness of the outbreak in India, there are people who are at extreme risk and have family here and vice versa, and they're worried about family members, and that's legitimate. And people, you know, are making the argument that this is a cruel and heartless policy. I can understand where they're coming from. On the other hand, the government says we need to do something in order to protect public health in Australia. We don't want an outbreak in Australia. This is tough, but necessary, they say. But I think it will be over pretty soon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Luke, for valuable insights, and thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That's all we have for now today. Thank you, everyone.